Hello, and welcome to today's event, Carbon Capture and Sequestration in California, Regional Insights and Community Attitudes. My name is Sally Allen. I'm the Executive Director of the Livermore Lab Foundation. We're pleased to be co-hosting today's event with our partner organizations, the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and the California Council for Science and Technology. As we all know, climate resilience and carbon management discussions are making headlines on a daily basis. With California and the nation moving toward carbon neutral economies, the foundation has been partnering with the Livermore Lab's Carbon Initiative team in recent years to advance solutions that will help California achieve its carbon neutrality goals. We believe it's important to keep science at the forefront of these conversations. With support from our funders, we've been talking to community leaders and other stakeholders across the state to identify regional priorities and find out what they already know about carbon capture and storage, and also to understand what issues are most important to them as the state considers its options in addressing carbon neutrality. We believe that what we're hearing and learning from others may be of value to you all, which is what brings us to today's discussion. Here is our agenda. We will have 3 panels today, each moderated by one of our colleagues at Livermore Lab, and featuring speakers with different perspectives on this topic from all around the state. As a reminder, there are detailed bios about each of today's speakers on the event registration page that you used to join today's program. We've also built time into each panel for questions from the audience. As most of you are likely familiar with Zoom webinar functionality by now, please use the Q&A button along the bottom of your screen to submit any questions. We've also enabled upvoting, so if you see a question that you would like to have addressed, make sure you hit the like button, and that'll move it to the top and help us to prioritize which questions we address today. We've also built in 2 very short breaks between sessions to facilitate the transition. So before we get started on our first panel today, we thought it would be helpful to do a quick audience poll to learn a little bit about who's joined us today. We had over 500 people register, which is really exciting and great to have so many people. So on your screen, you should be seeing a quick poll. If you can answer what industry you represent, that will help us get a sense of the room, so to speak. Thank you so much for responding so quickly. It looks like we've got about 1/3 of folks representing government, about 1/5 from corporations and business, and other really great representation across the board. Hopefully, I don't know if folks can see this on your end yet. We've got about 85% of the vote in. Great. So we've got government and business are kind of the top, and we've got a lot of academic research institutions and a lot of NGOs and our nonprofit folks as well. So I think, Lori, we can probably close the poll. We've got close to everyone there. Here are the results now that I think everyone can see. Super. Well, thank you so much. That helps give us a sense of who's in the room and also helps our speakers as they adjust their comments for today and understand the audience. Thanks again so much for being here with us. And again, we really would like this to be as interactive as possible, as much of a conversation as possible as a webinar will allow. So we encourage you to participate as much as you can throughout the morning. So to get us underway, I would like to introduce Dr. Roger Ains, who will be moderating our first panel. Dr. Ains is the Chief Scientist at Livermore Lab's Energy Program, responsible for managing the Carbon Initiative team at the lab. He was one of the authors of last year's Getting to Neutral report, along with its lead author, Dr. Sarah Baker, who's also joining us on this first panel. And with that, I will hand it over to Roger and Sarah to introduce the rest of the panel and get us underway. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, thank you very much, Sally, and welcome to everyone. I'm not sure you all see it, but we have 291 people online at the moment. So a lot of interest, and I'm delighted to hear that people really want to hear about this. Our first panel today has 3 experts in the area of carbon removal that could talk about both the results that we had from getting to neutral and the impact that it's had on the state. We're going to start with Dr. Sarah Baker, who's a group leader at Lawrence Livermore National Lab and is the lead author of the report. Sarah is going to tell us about some of the major conclusions of the report and what we've seen as the overall impact of that report. Should be followed by the Honorable Bill Quirk, who is a member of the State Assembly and, most importantly to me, the only scientist in the panel. So I couldn't decide whether to introduce him as Assemblymember Quirk, Dr. Quirk, the Honorable Bill Quirk, many honorations for Bill Quirk. He's also the chair of the Assembly Committee on Environmental Safety. And so he has a lot of important things on his plate in the Assembly, and we're very interested to hear what he thinks about the whole issue of carbon removal and carbon storage in the state of California. And then we'll complete the panel with Kate Gordon, who's the director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And Kate is the director of OPR, as well as the governor's advisor on climate. And she earned a JD and a master's in regional planning at the University of California, Berkeley, and has been a longtime advocate of the community participation in climate solutions. Well, getting to neutral was the first assessment of all the options that California has for finishing the job, not getting the removals that we need in the near term, but the ultimate getting to zero. And the assessment that we made was that this was going to need a new set of technologies. Could we have the first slide, please?
Sure thing.
This report came out a year ago, and if you want to read the report, it turns out it's pretty easy to Google getting to neutral and you'll be able to see the report. Next slide. And the basis for this report was the idea that there are some emissions that we're just not going to be able to control by stopping the emission itself. And that when California has a goal of getting to zero, we're likely to fall short of that if we don't have a set of technologies that include removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the staff of the California Air Board has now created this graph that shows their assessment of what that's likely to look like, where in 2045, we end up a little bit short of carbon neutrality with all the list of things that are on there. And if you'll click that again, Sarah. So at Livermore, our assessment was that we could make up that gap by adding these new carbon removal technologies. And we estimated that we might need 125 million tons a year in order to reach net zero. The Air Board staff has estimated about 85 million tons. Those numbers are very similar. We built in a little more cushion. And now I'd like to introduce Sarah to tell you about how we arrived at those conclusions and what we found. Sarah?
Sure. So as Roger said, the focus of our report was really how do we remove 125 million tons of carbon dioxide from the air by mid-century. And we studied three main categories that are relevant to California that are also technologically mature. So no miracles required here. All of the three sets of solutions that you see on the screen are proven to work. So the first on the left is natural and working land restoration. This is essentially using land management practices to store carbon in soils and plants. This is the lowest cost option and could get us about 25 million tons per year. And it has the bonus of cleaner air, water, and healthier ecosystems. However, these natural and working land solutions have the least amount of certainty in the amount of carbon and the length of time it can be stored. So we need more research on that. So the middle category is conversion of waste biomass to fuels with storage of the carbon dioxide that comes off of that processing. So this is essentially putting our waste biomass to work. This is the most impactful set of solutions and can get us 83 million tons per year at an intermediate cost. So essentially plants have done the hard work of capturing the carbon dioxide from the air and storing it. And so if we did nothing, this carbon dioxide would be re-released to the air. So it's a great set of solutions. And collecting this waste biomass and harvesting the carbon has a number of other benefits, including displacing fossil fuels with renewable fuels. And then the final solution is direct air capture. This is essentially using machines to pull carbon dioxide directly out of the air. And this makes up the difference. It's the most flexible solution, engineered solution, because it doesn't require land availability or biomass availability, but it's also currently the most expensive. But the more units we deploy, the more those costs will decrease. So just to summarize here, the main point is we need all three of these sets of solutions to get to 125 million tons. The relative fraction could change depending on other goals, but we need all three. All right, so we looked at focusing in on this waste biomass in California because it was such an impactful solution. We considered 5 broad categories of waste biomass and looked at its projected availability in 2045. And we found about 58 million bone dry tons will be available from waste in 2045. And if all of this carbon was carbon dioxide, it would correspond to 106 million tons. And again, if we did nothing, this would mostly be re-released through either decomposition or fire. So the categories of waste represented by these colors are the largest fraction of these are the forest management waste that you can see up in the north here. In the Central Valley, you can see agricultural residue. And then in Southern California, you can see the largest fraction of these bars is the municipal solid waste in blue. We can see that the availability by type changes across the state, but the amounts are broadly distributed, meaning the whole state can play a role in putting our waste biomass to work by removing carbon dioxide. All right, so this is our lowest cost cumulative distribution of options to reach 125 million tons. So this uses all of the low cost natural solutions that we identified in the green bar. So on the x-axis is million tons carbon dioxide per year, and the y-axis is the cost per ton. So we maximize natural solutions, we can get 25 million tons per year. And that's followed by this waste biomass conversion with capture of carbon dioxide. And so this was one of the most interesting findings. So these are the pink and reddish bars here. So this is gasification of waste biomass to hydrogen and carbon dioxide. So that's the technology that we found was the lowest cost per ton and also could get us the most carbon dioxide. And so this is really attractive both in cost and scale of carbon removal. These pathway would also produce about 4 million tons of carbon negative hydrogen, which is in line with the state's projected needs for hydrogen in mid-century. We could also convert this waste biomass to liquid fuels, but this would cost more on a system level because less carbon would be stored underground. So more direct air capture, which are the bars at the far right, would be required. All right, so California needs geologic storage to safely store the carbon dioxide captured from waste biomass and direct air capture to reach carbon neutrality. We estimate about 100 million tons of carbon dioxide must be stored underground in California every year by mid-century. Fortunately, California has some of the best geology in the world for carbon storage. And carbon storage works. The US has already put 14 million tons underground for storage alone. When carbon dioxide is put underground under pressure, it gains the properties of oil and can be stored in the same regions. So in this way, the sunset of the oil age can also be the rise of the storage age. We looked in depth at 2 regions in the state for the carbon storage capacity. These were the Bakersfield region and the Sacramento River Delta area. And we identified 17 billion tons, or about 200 years of storage in just these two locations. We don't actually view this as a 200-year activity. Carbon dioxide storage is needed now to buy time for the key aspects of our clean energy future to develop, including energy storage, carbon-free industry, as well as carbon recycling. We also analyze the cost of the transport of carbon dioxide to these two locations. And we found that it was a low fraction of the total cost, about $10 per ton, regardless of whether that carbon dioxide came from. But a pipeline along the center of the state would further decrease these costs. So I wanted to conclude with some of the big ideas from the report, from our analysis. So the first point is that Mother Nature can't do it on our own. So we need these natural solutions. They're very important and we need to use them, but they're not enough. We also need engineered solutions and geologic storage to get the amount of carbon removal that we need. The second point is how we think about the value of waste biomass. The idea that biomass is more valuable as a way to remove carbon than for carbon neutral energy is a paradigm shift. The conventional wisdom has been that biomass should be used for energy to displace fossil fuels. But we need to talk more about biomass for its value for capturing and storing carbon. This makes more economical sense too. At a LCFS value of $200 per ton, the carbon storage value of biomass is threefold that of the energy content. And then following along with this topic of waste biomass conversion, we identified the most impactful and least expensive use of waste biomass for carbon removal is to use it to make hydrogen. So this is a double win. We're drawing down the most carbon and we're making hydrogen for the state. So with that, I will stop sharing and pass to Roger.
Next up is the Honorable Bill Quirk. Bill, all yours.
Thank you, Roger. First of all, you briefed me on this. Must have been about the time it first came out. Seems like a century ago. It was only a year, but it's very ambitious, and it's the best summary I've seen, particularly in a way that at least a lay person with a science degree can understand what you're getting at, and it's very comprehensive. So again, I think it's an excellent piece of work. Second thing I would like to mention is there was a number in the presentation we just saw of 11 million metric tons per year coming from, I think, farming, other natural processes. There's something called the Carbon Cycle Institute, which carboncycle.org, which looks at how much could you really get from agriculture if you went all out. And they can get numbers, believe it or not, at 100 metric tons per year. I don't know what the right number is. Maybe it's less than 11, maybe it's more than 100. But I would suggest that, that you take a look a little bit further into that number. The California Department of Food and Agriculture has a program incentivizing farmers, people working with grazing cows for dairy, for meat, where they put a lot of compost on the soil and attempt to take up huge amounts of carbon per acre. I don't know how valid this is, but I think it's something that you might look into a little bit more. Second thing I'd like to say is you're also looking at this in the right way. Now, you would think we politicians, the first thing we do would be to look for, is this acceptable to the public? And the second is, how are we messing this up with contradictory regulations? And we don't. Unfortunately, the headlines all go to, we will decarbonize the electrical grid by 2045. And we have that goal, and it was a huge bill, but there was nothing in there, frankly, that made it easier to achieve the goal. It set the goal, but it didn't make it easier to achieve. And that is going to depend upon the two things you're going to be talking about in your next part of this seminar: public acceptance and regulation. An example of regulation that sort of marches over itself, if you want to build up the marshes. Now, if you're going to, the most environmentally favorable way to protect our cities is where we have marshes, to build them up. It's called a horizontal levee. When I was at Hayward City Council, we put a request for proposal out asking what is the best way to protect our shoreline. And the answer, primarily from Jeremy Lowe, who was at Environmental ESA in Sacramento, was to build up the marshes. And this has now become the way that the preferred way to protect the Bay Area. So Jeremy's now at the San Francisco Estuary Institute. They're looking at all the ways that we can build up where we can build up the marshes. There are places where you can't. Around the San Francisco airport, marshes are gone. The same for Oakland Airport. You're just going to have to use hard structure. But where you can, it's preferred to build up those marshes. That also, of course, will sequester carbon. But that's the best way to do it. And yet, when they first tried to go out and do it, they heard from federal Fish and Wildlife, you can't do that. They're endangered species. And these endangered species will be, how can I say, disturbed by your adding silt to those marshes to build them up higher. The problem is, of course, if we don't build up the marshes, they'll just go away. They'll be completely flooded over. And we recently passed in the Bay Area a measure to help with marsh restoration and building them up and preserving them. And they're going through and trying to bring all of the regulatory bodies together to do this. But that's an example of something that's a very good idea. And yet when it goes out there, regulations can prove a big problem. So I think you're concentrating on the right things. I think acceptance by your group is looking at your group who would develop these carbon capture caverns, that is also a very good thing to do. We see people over and over again objecting to solar in the desert, objecting to putting electrical lines out to the solar facilities, et cetera. So looking at acceptance by people, looking at contradictory regulations is extremely important. That's what you're doing, and I'm very glad you are. I do wish you could maybe look a little bit more at carbon sequestration from farming and grazing. I think there may be more there, but I don't know for sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. And to finish off our panel, Kate Gordon. Kate?
Thanks so much, Roger and Sarah and everyone at Livermore. Great report, and it does, I agree with the Assembly member, it seems like a very long time ago that we were originally briefed on this, but it's been a really important touchstone for the last year. I'll give a couple of remarks kind of about big picture, how the Newsom administration is thinking about these issues on carbon removal, and a little bit on some areas of focus in the budget, which I think really reflects learning over the past year, and some areas that we think are a priority. So as Assemblymember Quirk said, California has a goal of carbon neutrality by 2045. Traditionally, California has in its climate policy really mostly focused on emissions mitigation. So on technology and regulation toward emission mitigation from specific sources. And it's increasingly clear, I think, from all the science, from the IPCC, from this report, from others, that we need to address the CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. So that broadens our focus to adaptation, to resilience, to carbon removal. The Newsom administration and Governor Newsom really, frankly, one of the reasons I took this job at OPR, which is by nature an interagency cross-sectional kind of approach, long-term approach on policy, is that the governor really does take a whole of government approach to climate. He said that even before President Biden started saying that. It really is an integrated approach that looks at land use intersecting with economic development, intersecting with our environmental goals, intersecting with our equity goals. And we really see this work around carbon removal right at the center of all of those things. I particularly appreciate about this report that it kind of digs into the hard questions about how we actually get there. We are very good, I think, in government at setting goals. The important work is on the implementation and really focuses on that. Also, we'll point folks, if they haven't seen it, to the New Energy Futures Initiative and Stanford study that adds some critical, I think, data to this conversation as well. So in California, we really are looking at carbon removal in both sides, both land-based carbon removal and engineered carbon removal, sometimes referred to as CCS or CCUS. And you'll see a lot of movement on these things from the governor. Actually, on the land side, the governor's executive order calling for 30% of our land and coastal waters to be conserved, by which we mean still kept as natural and working land by 2030. Integration of natural working land into the scoping plan. Both of those processes directly acknowledge the role that our lands have in carbon removal and why that's part of our larger carbon and climate agenda for the state. On the engineered side, we do have the low carbon fuel standard currently in place, which is actually the most valuable credit for CCS that exists. So people tend to stack that on top of the federal 45Q credit and use those to drive projects forward. The question we're facing now is kind of what more can and should we do on the engineered side? We have a really important interagency group working on identifying opportunities. Matt Baker, who's deputy director at Resources, is on a future panel on this conversation and is leading that work. And we're looking at a couple of big areas in that interagency work. We're looking at areas where that are hard to decarbonize, particularly in the industrial side. So where is it hard to decarbonize? If we have the theory of the classic theory of electrify everything, do renewables wherever you can, be as efficient as possible, we also need to be looking at those places that are hard to decarbonize and where we can include carbon removal in those conversations. And the industrial sector is an obvious one. A big opportunity, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, is converting legacy forest and ag waste biomass into a more value-added product that actually contribute to our climate goals. And I'll talk about that in a second. And that, of course, is a focus of the Livermore report. So really appreciated your focus on biomass, on the sources of biomass, and on the highest value add products coming out of that, because that's a big focus for us right now. And then we're looking at the potential for direct air capture and what that might look like in the state. I wanted to underscore a couple of things Sarah said in terms, again, of that intersection of this work and economic and equity. In terms of the governor and our priorities, we have a significant amount of potential for underground carbon storage, as Sarah pointed out. And these are the same rocks that have held oil and gas for millions of years. This is a really interesting, possible kind of industrial diversification conversation with the oil and gas industry in California. My Office of Planning and Research, has been tasked by the governor to put together what he called an executive order, a just transition roadmap. We're actually sort of expanding that to more of a high road transition roadmap, looking at industries across California, what they will look like in a transition to carbon neutrality. The oil and gas industry is one. Frankly, forest is another, ag is another. And what are the opportunities that are opening up in this carbon neutrality conversation? The fact that these geological opportunities are there is really interesting to us. So I wanted to just put another point on that. Sarah made that point really well. The other point to make is, again, on economic development, we sort of had a decline of our timber industry about 20, 30 years ago, and we didn't really have a just transition strategy when that happened. we now have both communities that were traditionally dependent on timber and on forest activities, as well as an extremely intensive effort from our government and the legislature on forest management to reduce wildfire risk. As a result, we have an enormous amount of forest biomass coming out of our forests right now, in addition to the agricultural waste that we've had traditionally that, as you likely know, CARB has just kind of recommended that we start moving away from ag waste burning and toward other more value added and other products coming out of ag waste. So we have forest waste, we have ag waste. The governor is really interested in thinking about how we can leverage that for economic development opportunities in some of these communities that are some of, frankly, the lowest, the highest poverty rates, highest unemployment rates in the state of California, up in the Northern Sierras, also in some of our ag-based counties. So in the governor's budget released in January, we have a big push on wildfire management in general, but a piece of that wildfire budget really goes to economic development and proposes a position at our Office of Business and Economic Development to look at advanced wood products and value-added use of that forest biomass and ag biomass, creates funding into our Catalyst Fund, which is basically our Green Bank program at the Infrastructure Bank, to catalyze private investment into some of those types of projects, and also creates at my office, OPR, money for pilot projects and an X Prize around these same areas. And so we're really excited about the work that you've done at Livermore to look at where is the waste coming out, what are the high value products, and how does all of that contribute to our climate goals, our economic and equity goals, and really kind of move us forward toward carbon neutrality. So I will stop there, but thank you again for the great work.
Thank you very much, Kate. So we have a series of questions. Thank you all for upvoting the questions, and we're going to try and do a rapid fire set of answers, try to get to as many of these questions as we can. Sarah, I think the first one is for you. Where does biochar from waste biomass fit into this picture?
I don't think we looked in depth at waste biochar. It's certainly it certainly could make sense. We don't have quantification on that. I think there was just too much uncertainty into how long that carbon would be stored, but it's certainly worth looking at.
Thank you. Next question, are there significant water resources required for any of these carbon capture technologies? In a state where all of our electricity is being provided by renewables, the answer is not much, no. That most of the water demand associated with things like this comes from cooling for electric power production, but renewables don't require that. So while the natural and working lands certainly have water demands associated with them, the technological answers do not. How do we attempt to price CO2 utilization in the form of carbon negative concrete technologies? We did not look at a lot of utilization technologies in this report because we just gave ourselves an artificial limit. We said we have to have 1 million tons a year removed from the atmosphere to get into the report, just because we had to cut it off somewhere. And in California, we couldn't put our finger on 1 million tons a year of immediate concrete utilization. The next question, I think we're going to defer to another panel, the question of how many the forest fires that occurred this year. Rajinder, if you don't mind, I think we'll tee that one up for you when we're up, because we have an expert on the topic, so we should let her address that. Next one, Sarah, the biomass removal include considerations for ecosystem health and importance of leaving some waste material in the forest.
Yeah, so what we looked at was technical availability. This was outside of what, for example, a farmer would already plan to leave behind. So yeah, that was part of the consideration, but it is a complex issue.
Next question, have we considered geologic storage of hydrogen? No, we haven't. the hydrogen that we produce right now would mainly be used for transportation and would be used immediately. I could certainly see that in the long run, the state needs to think about how to buffer its hydrogen supply. And that's a question that I think we need to consider, but have not, at least Livermore has not considered that to date. Let's see, the next one, the elephant in the room is the engineered fossil fuel sector itself. Do you have any plan to ensure CDR doesn't further entrench the fossil fuel system? This is a question that arises all the time. And I will tell you that as a technologist, that is a question for policy. So Kate, maybe you want to take
I'll just say, I think, we are looking at solutions here that get us to carbon neutrality, which means that we're looking at identifying and promoting solutions that are not adding to the carbon load in California. So we're not, as a state, interested in particularly in continuing to promote things that for instance, create more, to put state money into things that, for instance, create more carbon, like enhanced oil recovery. There is a reason that's been a major focus of the industry to date. It's because there is value from enhanced oil recovery. It creates a product that can be sold. So I think one of the really important things about this report and our conversations in general is, where can we find value? We're not going to see 100 million tons coming out of a kind of a philanthropic or, kind of a philanthropic motive to get carbon out of the atmosphere. We need to find markets for this stuff. We need to find ways to create value, which is why we're really laser focused in our administration on market development strategies for this kind of work, and on looking for the kinds of things that you laid out in the report, Sarah, which actually would create new value. Will the oil and gas companies potentially have a role in that? Sure. If companies are interested in diversifying away from, traditional production and refining activities into activities that are supporting our carbon neutral future, we're absolutely interested in talking about that. These companies have a lot of skill. They have a lot of technical expertise. They've got a lot of R&D budget. So we're very interested in that conversation.
I'd like to add, I'm a big proponent of hydrogen for transportation. Half the people in the state don't have garages. Can we really set up at every public parking space a charging station? I don't think so. I think I have a hydrogen vehicle. I think for half the people of the state, that's going to be a better option. It's also the right option for long haul trucking. So it's there in transportation. I also believe it's there. We discussed briefly hydrogen storage. A professor by the name of Jack Brower at UC Riverside is the patron saint of these efforts of storing hydrogen, sending it through the current pipeline structure. And Sempra and PG&E, Sempra represents Southern California Gas, or owns it, and PG&E are the two big gas companies. They are both looking at converting their pipelines first to a combination of natural gas, renewable gas, and hydrogen, and eventually to purely hydrogen. We'll see how this goes, but there are going to be a lot of gas utilities out there, gas furnaces, cooktops, et cetera, for a long time. And those can run on hydrogen, at least it's been done. I don't know all the conversion problems, but it's going to be looked at very hard. And that's something no one knows better how to move hydrogen than the oil companies. There are a lot of good jobs, particularly for the construction trades in these refineries. Those same people could be moving hydrogen across the state. So we will see what happens.
Thank you. That highlights the fact that our report doesn't really get into the overall construction that's required to do this, but what we suggested is a fairly massive construction, and most of that effort occurs in the Central Valley and in the forest regions of the state. So that would be a significant change or addition to what we're doing today. Assemblymember Quirk, you raised a question yourself, which I wanted to address, which is the additional carbon removal from agricultural lands. We restricted ourselves in our report to things that we could identified today that would do 1 million tons a year with one technology, and that we understood the costs and the timing of them very well. We at Livermore are investing a lot of money in the science of agricultural carbon storage. We think it's a really good prospect, but we couldn't yet put our finger on that. And frankly, California is not the optimum place to do that. Places like Iowa and carbon soils in Iowa cover an enormous amount. But we think it's a very important strategy that has not yet been well enough developed, and we need to do more development of that to get to those kinds of capabilities that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I agree with that.
Are there other questions on the panel that you wanted to, you see the questions there? Is there something you wanted to answer? While you're looking, I'll say, did we consider mineral storage in basalt formations? Not in California, because frankly, California has the most fabulously good storage in the old oil rocks. There's simply nothing better technically than doing that. So we don't need to reach into something that is more difficult like basalt. Other questions you'd like to answer? So I want to thank the panel for a terrific set of discussions. And if there are further questions as we go on, the panel members will be here. We can try to answer them in writing. And with that, I think I want to pass it back to Sally and the break.
Thanks, Roger.
Thanks, Roger. We're going to take a quick break, everyone. We'll see you in less than 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you've been able to take a quick break, and it looks like we didn't have much of a drop off, which is fantastic because we still have a lot more coming up on today's event and conversations around carbon capture and storage. So thanks again for being here. To help us frame this discussion, this next panel, we thought it would be interesting to do another very quick audience poll. So that's going to pop up on your screen in a minute. The question is, how likely do you think it is that California will meet its goal of carbon neutrality by 2045? And we'll just give you a couple of moments to respond. We'll see if we have some optimists or pessimists in the audience today. Okay, we're coming up on about 50% of our audience members responding. Super. Well, 50-50 chance is pulling ahead, it looks like. But there's a good mix across the board. I don't think folks can see the results yet that I see in front of me, but we're at about 40% of people saying 50-50 chance of meeting the goals, about a quarter of the audience saying it's likely, and just about 6% saying very likely, another 20% saying unlikely, and about 7% very unlikely. So it's quite a good bell curve that we have going. Okay, that's really helpful. I think here's the results so folks can see. Thanks, Lori, for running that poll for us. Okay, so as I mentioned previously, over the past few months, the foundation has had an opportunity with support from our funders to survey over 1,200 residents throughout California, and also to have one-on-one conversations with dozens of stakeholders and community leaders to solicit their views and opinions about CCS and the priorities where they live and work. All of this work is the focus of our next panel today. So I'm happy to introduce our next moderator, Brianna Mordick-Schmidt, who is a staff scientist with the Lawrence Livermore National Lab on the Carbon Initiative team as well. Thank you, Brianna. And she's going to be joined by Dave Metz, who's our research partner for FM3, who took the lead on this work. Thank you both so much for being here and for leading this discussion. I'll hand it off to you.
Great, thanks, Sally. And I'll go ahead and introduce the panel that we'll have discussing the results as well. We have three great panelists today. Dr. Holly Buck, who's Assistant Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Buffalo. She's an environmental social scientist whose research focuses on the social dimensions of decarbonization technologies, including carbon capture and carbon removal. We also have Vanessa Suarez, who's a Senior Policy Advisor at Carbon 180. She works on federal policy across both nature and technological carbon removal with an emphasis on environmental justice. She's also from the Central Valley, so we're looking forward to her insights on the Kern County results. And we also have Eric Vink, who's the Executive Director of the Delta Protection Commission. He has a long history working on land and water conservation in California. And the Delta Protection Commission, for those who aren't familiar, produces reports and proposes policies aimed at protecting, maintaining, and restoring the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta region. So we're also looking forward to Eric's insights on the Delta region. And with that, I will hand it over to Dave.
All right, thank you very much, Brianna. Thanks everyone for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Dave Metz. I'm a partner with FM3 Research, a public opinion research firm based in Oakland and Los Angeles that does work on public policy issues around the state. And we're pleased to have conducted both qualitative and quantitative research to understand how the public in two distinct areas of the state that have been identified as suitable for carbon capture and geologic storage, both the Delta and Kern County, react to this idea. Not surprisingly, what our research showed us was that this is something that most members of the general public have not really begun to grapple with yet. It is still a very unfamiliar concept to them. But when given an introduction to the idea of what's required with carbon capture and storage projects, what some of the benefits to the communities may be, they reacted with what I would best describe as perhaps cautious optimism. We're going to go through some of the results of the surveys here today. I'm going to show you results both for the Delta and for Kern County. There are some places where there were interesting differences, but also a lot of similarities as well. So just to start off with a little bit about the qualitative interviews before we lead into some of the numbers from the quantitative survey. The data we're sharing here comes from one-on-one interviews we did with a variety of community leaders and stakeholders, both in the Delta region and Kern County. We ended up conducting over 30 interviews across the two regions with individuals who come from the constituencies you'll see highlighted in the second bullet. My colleague, Miranda Everett, who is with us today, conducted most of the interviews herself. They were about minutes in, and we basically through a series of open-ended to understand what people knew about storage and what role they thought it might play in their region. Now we asked a few broad questions about people's perceptions of the future of each region. And a lot of the responses we got were, with some obvious regional variations, fairly similar. Lots of concern about natural resources in both regions. In the Delta, water was the dominant concern, ensuring that local water supplies are protected, that they're adequate, that saltwater intrusion can be fought off. In Kern County, water also a concern, much more focused on groundwater there and having adequate supplies for agriculture. Also a lot of concern about air pollution in Kern County. There was not a lot of specific focus on climate change initially as a driver for these threats, although obviously both air quality issues and water supply issues do have some important impacts that come from climate change. But those were the things that our respondents thought of most frequently as the major changes facing the region in the future. We then gave them a basic description of carbon capture and storage, and their existing familiarity with the technology varied a great deal. For some, especially those in Kern County who had some connections with the oil or gas industries, they had heard about the technology, they understood the potential for its use in Kern County. In the Delta, there was much less initial familiarity, which led to a series of questions from our respondents about why these kinds of projects might be pursued and what their impacts might be on the region. You'll see here some of the questions that our respondents in the Delta raised most often. Why are these projects necessary? Why here in the Delta, where we have these vital water supplies, both for our own community and for other parts of the state, as well as sensitive wildlife habitat? What might the risks be? A lot of people drew analogies mentally to fracking or to other types of exploration for fossil fuels and wondered if there would be threats to groundwater or seismic risks that might follow. And more fundamentally, if this is in some sense a dangerous substance that is causing some sort of risk that we need to bury it underground, how confident can we be that it will stay there? And if it leaks, what kinds of risks might that pose to the community? A lot of them wanted to hear examples. How has this been done elsewhere? Are there places where these kinds of projects have been carried out successfully that are analogous to our own experience in the Delta, where we believe that the way it has worked elsewhere might give us confidence that it can work here? And what might its impacts be on the local economy and on infrastructure? In Kern County, we heard far fewer of these questions, perhaps less initial skepticism to start out with. And I think a lot of the debates that have happened in the Delta around water supplies have primed some of the stakeholders we talked to there to be suspicious when they hear about people from outside the region wanting to come in and implement projects that might impact the region's natural resources. In Kern County, there was much more openness to the idea initially among the stakeholders that we talked to. People saw this as a chance for Kern County to become a leader, to implement a new technology which could be implemented around the state and around the country. They saw economic benefits that could come from taking advantage of it. And because many of them were familiar with the way that the oil and gas industry operated, they saw some easy analogies between the kinds of technology that are used there and the kind that might be used for CCS, which led them to have fewer initial reservations about its potential safety or feasibility. Now, these qualitative conversations were with some grass top stakeholders and people who have a little bit higher level of awareness and engagement about public policy issues facing their region. We followed that with quantitative surveys, which were designed to speak much more to the perceptions of the general public. We interviewed random samples of registered voters in Kern County and in the Delta. You'll see here the methodological details of the survey. These were telephone and online interviews. The telephone interviews were conducted on landline and wireless phones and in both English and in Spanish. They were conducted in late October of last year in the Delta and then January of this year in Kern County. Very similar questionnaires used for both interviews with some modifications to reflect the different local contexts of each community. So what did we learn from this research with the general public? First, just a bit about the overall mood of the population in both locations. As is the case around California right now, there's a lot of ambivalence about the way things are going. A standard question that opens a lot of the polls we do, which pollsters developed in the 1940s, and we've kind of been stuck with using it since. Do you feel like things in your region are headed in the right direction or off on the wrong track? And as you'll see, voters in both Kern County and the Delta are split with a little bit more negative sentiment than positive sentiment. Obviously, this comes from some apprehension around the impacts of the pandemic and what's happened to the economy as a result of it. To put a finer point on some of the concerns that might be driving those wrong track responses, we offered the respondents a list of issues facing their community and asked them to rate each as either an extremely, very, somewhat, or not serious problem in their region. You'll see here the issues that respondents in each region were most likely to rate either an extremely or very serious problem. And while the impacts of the virus, both on public health and the economy, are among their top concerns, you'll also see a lot of those natural resource issues really rising to the top of the list too. Almost all the top concerns in the Delta have some connection to local water supplies. Water is a concern in Kern County as well, but air quality, also a strong concern there. Unemployment in both regions, also a broadly shared concern by about 2/3 of those polled. Now, to dig a little bit more deeply into attitudes toward climate change, we asked a couple of questions about perceptions of what's causing climate change and what its local impacts might be. And for comparison purposes, we replicated some questions that are asked by the Yale Project on Climate Communications and regular national surveys they conduct. And as you'll see, sizable majority of residents in both regions believe that climate change is caused mostly by human activities, right around 3 in 5 respondents offering that opinion, very similar to the average that we see in national surveys, where it's around 62%. So there is a belief that yes, climate change is caused by human activity and therefore steps to address it have to take that into account. We also see that majorities of residents in both regions acknowledge that climate change is going to have a significant impact on them personally. More than 2/3 of those in the Delta region and a solid majority of those in Kern County said that they believe climate change would cause them at least a moderate amount of harm. In both regions, that is significantly higher than the 43% of American adults who hold that same perception. I suspect a lot of that is driven by awareness of issues around drought and our recent experience with wildfires in California, which we've seen in other research. Voters do connect to climate change. Now, while there may be a recognition that climate change poses a serious problem, the average voter is not terribly familiar with actions that the state is taking to address it. A majority of Kern County residents and more than 60% of those in the Delta region say that they're familiar with the goals the state has set for reducing climate change, but only about 1 in 10 in each region are very familiar. And that tends to be a truer indication of people who have a real working knowledge of public policy issues. So for most, yes, they may have a general sense that the state is doing something, but they don't have a very specific sense of the actions it's taken or the goals it has set. Now, when introduced to those goals, we see broad support in both regions. Describing the state's carbon neutrality goal, 64% of Kern County residents back it, as do 73% of residents of the Delta region. And support in the Delta region is also notably strong. If you look at the top bar on the slide, the dark blue bar, that represents the proportion of voters who say they strongly back this goal. And it is almost half of those in the Delta region that offer not just support, but strong support. Now, the role that carbon capture and storage might play in helping to achieve those goals is really new subject matter for most voters in both regions. Again, we asked a question about how familiar they are with carbon capture and storage, and only a little more than 1/4 of voters in either region characterized themselves as even somewhat familiar with it. About 1 in 20 describe themselves as very familiar, which again is a truer indication of the real working knowledge that voters may have. So this is really a blank slate. It's something that most members of the public are hearing about for the very first time. For that reason, and anticipating that would be the case, we read them a description of what carbon capture and geologic storage entails, and then asked them to indicate their reactions to this technology using a feeling thermometer, essentially a scale from 0 to 100, where people can rate whether they have a favorable or unfavorable reaction and indicate by the number they choose the intensity of those sentiments. 50 is a neutral midpoint score on the scale. And so as you'll see, we have majorities or pluralities that offer a positive reaction. The average scores are in the upper 50s in both regions, but in each case, not a very intense reaction. The number of respondents who are offering a response in the top decile, scores in the 90s, is fewer than 1 in 5. So it sounds good to them, but they're not fully on board yet. They're not having a strongly positive reaction right off the bat. We also asked a follow-up question and said, all right, if this technology was going to be employed, not just as a general principle, but in your region, near you, what kind of reaction do you have to that? So you'll see if you compare the average numbers at the top of the slide to the bottom of the slide, how much support dropped off when people thought about it as a local project as opposed to something that would just be done in principle. And while the numbers remain positive overall, they do drop when people think about it in the local context, particularly in the Delta region, where it becomes a much more mixed response when people are thinking about the use of this technology locally. Now, to try to understand some of the factors which might drive positive or negative reactions, we offered the respondents a list of some of the things that might be components of carbon capture and storage projects and asked them to indicate whether they supported or opposed each one. We've ranked them here by the total proportion that indicated they would support each component. The numbers are ranked by the Kern County number, but you'll see there's not a huge difference between the two regions in the way that people react. Most of the ideas that you'll see on this slide, these kinds of aspects of carbon capture and storage projects, are the ones that have the broadest support, majority support in most cases. Requirements that will protect the environment, reduce pollution, ensure public accountability and transparency in the way that projects are carried out, are all positively received, as is the notion that these projects would create jobs. that they would also help the state meet those climate goals that voters support, even if they're not terribly familiar with them. On the second slide, you'll see items that got more of a mixed reaction. And you'll note that the support numbers dropped down under 50% here. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the public was expressing opposition to these concepts, simply that there are larger groups that say they don't know or don't have an opinion, or that it would make no difference to them if this kind of element were part of the project. The only places where they had the greatest reservations tended to be those that dealt with the transport of carbon to the region. If it's coming by barge in the Delta or by truck in Kern County in particular, voters expressed some concern about those methods of transportation. And again, as you'll see toward the bottom of the slide, the notion of locating these projects within a mile of where they live also led them to feel more ambivalent. If they're not familiar with the technology, initially they may have some reservations about having it close by. Now, if the public is generally, at least cautiously open to these kinds of projects, we do see that initially they don't view them as particularly urgent. Only about 1/3 of respondents in Kern County and slightly more in the Delta indicated that they viewed these projects as very important to undertake. And as much as they want to see something done about climate change, as we saw in the earlier slides, and support the state's goal of carbon neutrality, they don't begin with any recognition of how critical a piece this technology might be in helping to achieve those goals, which of course is totally understandable. The average member of the public is not focusing on these issues in any great detail. And it does suggest that some communication and outreach will really be important to draw those connections for members of the public that don't fully understand them. One final question that we asked dealt with a variety of people and organizations that might be sources of information about these kinds of projects. We asked people whether they would generally trust or be suspicious of what each of them had to say. We varied the list of messengers that we tested in each region to reflect the local context. And you'll see on the first slide some of the messengers that were viewed as most credible. Generally, it tended to be organizations that people saw as providing some kind of valuable public service or being important to the local economy, and most importantly, did not have themselves an ideological or economic self-interest that might lead them to take a position on this technology. The national labs in the Delta region were viewed as highly credible, but firefighters, farmers and ranchers, doctors and nurses, scientists and researchers, small business owners also seen as very credible messengers in this capacity. On the second slide, you'll see some of the organizations for whom the credibility numbers were somewhat lower. Again, that doesn't necessarily entail a negative reaction, just in some cases less familiarity. But government, industry, labor, people who are seen as having more of a personal economic stake in the way that these projects are carried out, generally are viewed with a little bit more caution in terms of the credibility of information that they may share. So some of the key conclusions of the research are summarized here. I won't belabor them, but again, I think very useful starting point. This is a public in both regions, a whole lot of technology uses about it is open to the use of this technology, but it's going to require more information before local residents feel fully confident that this is something that they want to see move forward, as much as it does connect to some of the broad goals they share for addressing the impacts of climate change in California. With that, I'll hand it back to Brianna.
Great, thank you, Dave. And just wanted to address one question that came up briefly, which is people noticed that for some of the responses there were null values, and that's because some answers were offered in Kern or the Delta that weren't offered in the other region. So it's the only reason why you didn't see results for some versus the other.
Correct.
Great. So just to make sure everyone's kind of oriented to where we're talking about here, let me just quickly share this. So in the last panel, we heard that there are 2 regions in California that have the best geologic storage potential, the Sacramento, San Joaquin River Delta, and Kern County. And so that's why we chose these 2 regions to run the survey. So just so everyone is kind of oriented to where these 2 surveys occurred and why we chose to do them there. So as a sort of initial matter, why don't we just go around to the different panelists? It'd be great if you could give your sort of initial reactions, or if there's anything that stood out to you from the survey results. And why don't we start with Holly?
Hey, yeah, I'd like to talk for just a few very brief minutes about the wider context of this research in terms of other studies of community perceptions of CCS, because as you all know, this isn't a new issue, even though sometimes it feels new. There's been a lot of discussion over the past decade and a half. So I want to focus on three things. Is this research in California different than in other parts of the US? What do we still not know, and how might we use this knowledge? On this first point about how these findings compare with studies elsewhere, in many respects, they're very similar to what we've seen in national surveys, and similar to studies in particular locations in the US. Low familiarity with CCS. The numbers here are very similar, slightly more familiar perhaps than in national surveys. Secondly, industry and government tend to score low on trustworthiness with CCS, although in other research, researchers and NGOs were seen as more trustworthy. Maybe in these two regions, NGOs had a little bit of a less profile than other research. Also, there's a relationship between climate change awareness and support. For example, in a study of CCS in Southeast Texas, climate change awareness was a significant predictor of both individual and community level support. A lot of the questions people have are the same in many studies. What are the risks? What are the costs? What happens to the CO2 in the long term? Does it stay underground? What's in it for our community? And so I think that some of the main benefit of this study is not really the info about CCS, but understanding the wider context and concerns in these two places. And I also want to highlight one study that was done by researchers from Berkeley, who back in 2007 did focus groups in Thornton and Rio Vista, which at that time were potentially project sites for West Carb for CCS. And they found that communities really want a voice in defining the risks to be mitigated, as well as the justice of the procedures by which the technology is implemented. And they said that a community sense of empowerment is really key here. Empowerment, including the ability to mitigate the risks of the technology. And interestingly, citizens in Rio Vista, who were generally more aware of climate change than ones in Thornton, that knowledge about climate change had little impact on their willingness to host a CCS project. They would only consider hosting a site if their local economy saw direct benefits like royalties, and that they could exercise some control. As one resident said back then, "We will keep watching." And so there's a question of whether the context has changed between 2007 and 2021 because of the climate crisis and mounting climate impacts and different use cases for CCS coming online. So that's one of the many things we need to understand better, including we still don't fully know if people understand this in the same way as citing renewable energy as low carbon infrastructure as a category, or if they see it as waste disposal, or is it in the same conceptual category as fracking? Some other research has pointed to that. So one thing we need to figure out. We also don't know how much people's perceptions are being informed by local issues versus national level climate policy concerns and the role of CCS in that strategy. And we're still learning more about on what conditions do people see actual real tangible benefits. So with how do we use this knowledge, it's a starting place for those conversations about public engagement. And I guess one of the things I'd draw attention to there, we can talk a lot more about that, but there's a discussion to be had around community compensation and community benefits. And the research has shown that to be effective, compensation and benefits need to fit with local needs. It's not enough on its own to offer something, and it actually can be interpreted as bribing a community. So it's important to have public engagement around that at a very early stage, understanding types of benefits. And that's only one part of social license, this economic legitimacy. Other parts like whether a company acts fair and respects local ways of life. Two-way dialogue, also really important. So I hope that this research can be a first step in thinking about how to have a meaningful two-way dialogue with communities in California and elsewhere.
That's great. Thanks, Holly. Vanessa, any sort of initial reactions or things that stood out to you?
Yeah, first, I just want to say I appreciate the outreach efforts of Lawrence and both of you in conducting this study, especially the outreach that happened in both English and Spanish. I think incorporating, language access and language justice in these types of studies is super key in ensuring that, public engagement is really robust. I want to echo Holly's thoughts that, the general lack of knowledge around CCS, I'll even go into negative emissions technologies and a lot of these kind of climate tools is, there's just like this general lack at the local levels and at the national levels. And this can, pose really important considerations for public acceptance and really ensuring that communities feel ownership in the deployment of these technologies and, not just like an acceptance or kind of like a consultation, but that communities are leading how these projects are going to look in their own communities. There were a couple of components of the survey that made a lot of sense to me or didn't exactly surprise me. So I think air and water quality issues being major concerns in Kern County and across the San Joaquin Valley makes a lot of sense. These communities have existing pollutions and burdens that have historically impacted public health and the environment for decades. And so having these priorities come out in the survey, I think makes a lot of sense and is going to be a really key consideration in the types of CCS projects that are pursued to be deployed within these regions. I also think the jobs and economic factor made a lot of sense in the survey results as well. So Kern County and the San Joaquin Valley have many regions that are low income areas. And so the history of the oil and gas industry has in some part provided jobs and economic opportunities historically. And this has been looked upon, I think, kind of in contentious ways. So there have been some benefits to this, but there have also been lots of drawbacks in, the deployment of these technologies in these communities. And so as the survey showed, I think the transition away from fossil fuels is going to be kind of like a big concern in Kern County and the San Joaquin Valley. There are a couple of things from the survey results that I would also like to highlight. So the hopefulness of Kern County interviewees in energy leadership, I think, was really exciting. So while several saw, I think, this in different ways, some saw this as kind of building on the existing expertise that, Kern County and other counties have. Others kind of saw an opportunity to reinvent the county as an energy and renewable energy types. And so, I think this can raise lots of considerations and conversations for what the future of energy can look like in Kern County. If there are any, potential considerations for energy and technology lock-ins, I think those are concerns that could be raised by many community members and definitely warrant conversations from developers and folks who are invested in these technology types. The second thing I want to highlight is the kind of, demand across the board that these projects have to have demonstrable benefits aside from just climate. So providing those permanent new jobs, allowing for communities to take ownership and provide, public engagement throughout the entire project process from inception to even, I think, like post-site closure or like site transfer is incredibly important. And so also, like, the last thing, the need for, strict protections for land, water, and wildlife. I think this, along the lines of existing literature that we have seen, these resonate very strongly with kind of what has come, not just from these communities, but I think many other communities who have also had potential CCS conversations or projects that have almost been deployed, I think, in their communities. And I think, when we look at previous projects, including the hydrogen, the HICA CCS project that was proposed in 2009 also had really similar key messaging points. And so it seems there's a continuation that these projects need to provide, benefits for these communities besides just carbon sequestration. So I think we really should be taking that into account, especially for future project deployment. One thing I will say, I was hoping to see in the survey ethnic and racial demographics from the counties that were surveyed. I think including racial justice and racial equity into these conversations is really important. Historically, oil and gas industries, and I think, many other types of energy industries have had disproportionate impacts on Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And in the San Joaquin Valley, we have many communities that are predominantly, Latino, that, speak majority Spanish rather than English. And so taking into consideration kind of the racial and ethnic compositions of the communities that we're thinking of deploying projects in is going to be really crucial to ensure that we, one, don't add any more burdens or pollutions to these communities, but also attempt to redress historical harms that have been happening, and hopefully pave the way for communities, these communities and others to, decide what energy future they want for themselves in a way that's going to really just undo historic harms.
That's great. Thanks, Vanessa. And there was a question that came in the Q&A as well about the demographics. So I'll maybe flip that to Dave, but I'll just give Eric a chance first to discuss sort of his impressions and things that stood out to him.
Great. Thank you, Brianna and Holly and Vanessa. Very interesting presentation. Thank you, Dave, for the work that your firm did on this. I'm going to offer a Delta perspective. For those joining the meeting, if you didn't quite make it out from the map earlier, just kind of imagine an area between Sacramento and Stockton at the east side, and then moving west as the rivers flow toward the bay. That's the Delta region. And I guess I start with some background assumptions and understandings. The first assumption, and this was reflected in the survey results, was that all of these safety issues, whether it's, you can store carbon safely underground in an area that does have some level of seismic risk, which defines the Delta. You don't have water effects on groundwater or surface water from moving the carbon into the ground. We're used to natural gas wellheads in the Delta, so that doesn't really deter us, but we have to make sure that all of those safety issues are really run to ground, and that you're prepared to address those and answer those in a real forthright way at the start. And I think the survey results reflected that. The other is, and by the way, I'm really speaking on behalf of the Delta community. I am with the state of California agency, the Delta Protection Commission, and my counterparts I noticed are on this meeting as well, from the Delta Stewardship Council and the Delta Conservancy. We're very well covered in the Delta region with state agencies, but our role at the commission is to really represent the Delta community in these larger discussions, and to work to protect and enhance Delta agriculture, recreation, cultural values, and natural resources as are called out in state law, even as we go about accomplishing our primary goals for the Delta, which are ensuring water supply reliability. We're the switching yard for California, much of California water, and restoring the Delta ecosystem is the second of the two state's two goals for the Delta. But anyway, the representing the Delta community, the other point I wanted to make is to really understand the baseline condition in the Delta, which is that the Delta community, and especially the vast rural area of the Delta, has great sensitivity to large infrastructure projects that are really primarily designed to serve others with little or no local benefit to the Delta. And I mentioned us as the switching yard for California water. For decades, there have been proposals to replumb the water system. The current iteration is called the Delta Conveyance project. And those are projects that benefit exporters. They're really not designed to provide benefit to the Delta region, and in fact would create grave consequences during both the construction period and in how those projects are operated were they to be built. So we're a region that is very sensitive to anyone coming from outside the region saying, we've got a great idea here that's, you know, primarily to serve others, but it's going to be good for you as well. And so in that regard, we're very much from Missouri on this. You're really going to have to show us how this does provide a local benefit if it's sited in the Delta. Just a few considerations. I think this was alluded to, if not outright captured in the survey results, but certainly one big issue that we would be concerned about in the region is how you get carbon to the region. Trucking is a grave concern in our region. We have narrow roads, often they're on levees. They can be very unsafe for trucks. We're already heavily trafficked, not just with local traffic and local agricultural traffic, but the state highways that cross through the Delta region bring thousands and thousands of commuters through the heart of the region every day. And so transportation would be a very grave concern for how you get the carbon from where it's generated to where it needs to be inserted into a pipeline or a wellhead. I'm not sure how it gets into the ground, but the way you put it into the ground. I appreciate what Holly stated about community benefits. That would be at the fore of our mind as well. It really has to extend beyond the benefits to individual landowners and how the benefits of carbon storage might accrue to the larger community. And certainly one idea to do that is to support ongoing improvement of levees in the Delta region. Really everything in the Delta is built upon the foundation of our levees, whether it's the agriculture, the historic communities, the significant critical regional infrastructure that passes through the Delta. That's everything from transportation, state highways, rail lines, to gas and oil pipelines, electrical transmission corridors, billions of dollars worth of regional infrastructure are also reliant upon those levees, keeping the leveed islands dry. So how carbon storage could have a broader benefit to supporting levee improvements would be very important. I think my fellow colleagues on the panel also talked about improving conditions in the communities, and some of these are in the Delta where the carbon emissions are generated. That would be critically important as well. And then finally, we do have a history of oil and gas extraction from the Delta, and I don't know enough about whether those oil and gas wells have been properly closed. I know that's of concern elsewhere in the state, but to the extent that historic oil and gas wells have not been properly closed, that would be another important benefit to provide relative to carbon storage, and maybe even essential for the success of the technology. So those are some thoughts I wanted to offer up here.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Dave, is there anything you can say about the demographics of the survey?
Sure. So the survey was conducted with a random sample of registered voters in each region. And we're able to set quotas for a variety of different demographic variables that are on the voter file, things like age, party, gender, ethnicity, specific geography within the region. And so we took steps to make sure that we had as random and representative a sample of all registered voters within each region as possible. And as Vanessa noted, also conducted the survey in English and Spanish to try to ensure that language barriers wouldn't be a barrier to participation.
Great, thanks. So for all the panelists, I think these are themes that you all touched on. These are two themes that we saw emerge in the survey, and questions that are coming in from the audience. We kind of see, Economy and jobs is a big theme. We also see environmental protection as a big theme. And I think those reflect some of the broader challenges that we're confronting in the transition to a clean economy, which is how do you make sure that the workers from the fossil economy aren't left behind? And how do you protect people who have been most harmed by the previous economy and make sure that this transition doesn't also leave them behind with, environmental justice concerns? How can we best address those? Is there tension there? And what are the sort of issues that you see in deploying CCS or carbon removal that touch on both of those things? And any of you feel free to jump in.
Maybe I'll venture a thought on that. Just to think more about what we mean by environmental justice concerns. So environmental justice has multiple dimensions. One is procedural justice, which is, are the decisions made fair? Do people have a say in the process of making them? And that's what we're talking about with public engagement, although there's separate, right? Public engagement doesn't necessarily lead to procedural justice, but it could be a part of it. And then there's distributive justice, which is how are the harms and the benefits distributed. And so a lot of the conversation tends to focus on the risks, which is really important to understand them and map them out, as Vanessa also was talking about. But then thinking about who the benefits flow to, I think that public engagement that really brings that in deeply into the conversation, that's not viewed as a tick box exercise in consulting or informing publics, but really asks questions about what benefits could you see that would be useful to you? How do we achieve them is a starting point. And one part on that public engagement, there's been research that finds that actually it's important to have informal public engagement alongside more formalized mechanisms. So I'd encourage actors like the lab and people listening to take part in that. I think it could really help.
Just to kind of jump in and also partly answer a question that I saw in the Q&A chat. I think, robust public engagement can be really crucial in promoting procedural justice. So ensuring that local community voices are heard and meaningfully incorporated from inception to site closure can be a great avenue for, kind of lessening the tension between all of these different priorities and making sure that developers can really address what communities want to be seeing when these projects are deployed. So, robust public engagement helps better decisions ultimately be made. And there are benefits for both developers and communities. When communities have more information, they're able to make better and more informed decisions about, the types of technologies, what CCS technologies they want to see, where they want projects to be deployed, what specific benefits that they would like, whether that be for community compensation or through community benefit agreements. I think there are definitely different avenues that can be taken in order to ensure that communities do feel like they are reaching, that they are getting benefits from these projects. And in that similar sense, developers can gain public trust, which is super key in ensuring that publics, get off the ground and also do what they're meant to do. And so I think, through these processes, projects and plans can be co-created. And I really want to emphasize that. Going back to kind of the point of community acceptance, I think projects will be better or will be able to align better with what community needs are, what their values are, priorities. And in that sense, just align across all of the different priorities, really find a synergy in that CCS can help us meet our climate goals and also provide non-climate benefits to the communities that are going to be placed next to these technologies.
Great, thanks. Another sort of question, we saw in the survey that a lot of people do understand or feel the urgency of needing to act on climate. We saw from the previous panel on getting to neutral that, there is a real need to deploy these projects at scale as soon as possible. But obviously also from our discussion, we're hearing that, you know, it's critically important that the community be engaged in these processes. Is there tension between the sort of speed and the need to engage the community? Can those things work together?
Maybe I'll jump in again. I have thoughts on this. So in my view, I think that there is a tension, and I'm curious what other people think. I do think that, though, I mean, so there's a trade-off between the speed and the time it takes to engage publics. But right now, I think that the public engagement is more important than getting a bunch of facilities permitted and built in the next 5 years, because if we do this right and develop a model for how to engage with the community in the right way, that's a model that other places can point to. And then in the whole US, we can get better scale up, because people want to see an example of this actually working for somebody somewhere. So the demonstration projects we talk about financing demonstration scale for the tech itself, which is critical, but we also need to demonstrate the processes to get there socially. And what these arrangements might look like, what policies work for people. So if we invest more in that now, it could buy us a lot, you know, in the later part of this decade, is how I see it.
I think the challenge is going to be, you know, someone's going to be first, and you'll have to work through a lot of these issues for whoever is first. Hopefully that first example, whether it's in the Delta or Kern County or elsewhere, is completed in such a way that it, you know, provides a good tale to tell elsewhere about how this can be done with, you know, respect to local concerns, and then obviously ensuring that, you know, all those technical issues are appropriately worked through and addressed. But I just get back to some of those questions in the survey. You know, the beauty of having the survey is that you've already got a roadmap of what type of, you know, concerns people will be most attuned to. And I think just really emphasizing an approach to those early on would be very important.
And I also think when we have, you know, these robust and meaningful processes from, you know, inception, it also helps with, you know, not having to constantly go back to the drawing board of, you know, what, okay, this went wrong, communities didn't want this, like, what else can we do? If you have communities involved from the very beginning, dictating, you know, what they want to see, what they accept, what they would like to take ownership of for their own energy futures, then, you know, the synergies just kind of fall into line, and it makes it so much easier, I think, for all, you know, all parties involved to get a project really like off the ground and running. And so, you know, like I said before, there are benefits for not just communities, but also developers when these processes are really meaningful from the beginning.
Thanks. Yeah, and we have actually just a few minutes left. You know, as we discussed at the beginning, you know, this is really just the first step in really learning and starting to hear what the concerns and priorities of these different communities are. So question for each of you, where would we go next with this work? What are the next steps? And just if you have any sort of closing thoughts that you want to share, and we'll go in, how about reverse order from what we started? So why don't we start with Eric?
Well, I think I probably alluded to that with my earlier comment. I think the place to start first off is with, you know, those aspects about this that setting to rest the concerns that people everywhere would have about these projects that aren't just specific to a region. And so whether it's about, you know, safely getting the carbon into the ground, ensuring that it stays there, that it's you know, inert once it's in the ground, it doesn't have other effects. And then from there, moving to the very, you know, specific concerns that you might find in each region. You know, we would have a different set of concerns in the Delta region than probably would be true in Kern County. And it starts with, you know, this sensitivity we have about these large infrastructure projects. And, you know, we're within the next year, we'll be, you know, squarely confronting the replumbing proposal in the Delta, the tunnel project, and really what that means. And so, you know, we're kind of in a quiet phase now while the background environmental review and the engineering and design work is occurring. But once that proposal is formally announced, then, you know, that's the 8,000-pound gorilla in the region, taking up all of the attention. So, you know, this will just be viewed as additive to that. And so, you know, I think as the sooner, and especially in the next year when things are fairly quiet on the tunnel front, you know, the sooner you can, if the intention is to propose projects in this region, that you can get out there and begin to talk about that and, you know, highlight how you address these underlying questions that people have about the technology, I think the better.
Thanks. Vanessa, any closing thoughts or where we go next?
Yes, so for Kern County specifically, I just want to reiterate, I think it's really important to address the long history of oil and gas within the county, the implications that that has had, not just for jobs and economics, but also for, you know, environmental burdens and cumulative impacts. We didn't get the chance to really discuss this much, but, you know, you can go on Cal EnviroScreen online. It's run by Cal EPA, and it can show you kind of the levels of pollution and cumulative impacts that these communities are facing. Oh, thank you, Brianna. So yes, I will just leave that there, won't touch too much. But then at the general level, I do have kind of some recommendations. So I think it's really important across the board, not just in Kern County, but, you know, for all CCS projects, that any project that does go forward has to have the climate and non-climate benefits. And I think these benefits should attempt to be, you know, legalized whenever agreements are made between developers and communities, so that communities have the assurances that these benefits are going to be demonstrated in the in their communities. I think actively co-consulting and co-creating these projects from inception to post-site closure, like I mentioned before, is going to be really crucial in promoting procedural justice within CCS project deployment. Creating and executing engagement plans that take into account burdens or barriers to participation. So, you know, when we have low-income areas, not everyone has a car, there's not always great public transportation infrastructure, which I can say is really true for the San Joaquin Valley. And so, you know, folks don't have the means to go to a meeting, or maybe they have really irregular work shifts or childcare concerns. And so I think there are a lot of barriers that can be really community specific that should be on the burden should be on the developers to address these and create engagement plans that are going to kind of get around as best as they can these barriers. My couple last things I'll say is ensuring that projects don't create or impose any new burdens on communities. So kind of going back to what we saw with Kern County and the San Joaquin Valley in general, these communities already have so many, disastrous cumulative pollution impacts. I mean, the highest air quality or the highest air pollution in the country, I think, is like something really astronomical and needs to be considered in CCS projects. And, you know, the CCS retrofits and technologies that can address air quality, I think, should be prioritized when it comes to R&D. And then the last, which I really want to emphasize, is placing the ultimate decision-making power in the hands of the community. So if a community, you know, decides that they don't want a CCS project, then developers need to step back and say, okay, we're going to do something else then. And I think it's really important too, kind of along these lines, that developers provide alternatives to their CCS projects. Historically, this has not happened. We've seen, you know, DOE's NETL has not provided action alternatives in a lot of the environmental impact statements that they've released for CCS projects. And I think this is kind of, you know, cutting communities out of the opportunity to, you know, think about what their energy futures can look like and decide what actions are best for them. So that was a really long running list, but those are just some of my thoughts on what folks can do at Kern County and kind of broader levels.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, it's a complicated topic. So Holly, final word goes to you.
Yeah, I think next steps, we need to do three things in parallel. First, we need a creative policy conversation, including multiple stakeholders, about specific arrangements for delivering benefits. We need to understand what options might even be there. because right now it's pretty vague. Second, we need informal public engagement around both CCS and CDR more generally. I think led by a cultural or educational institution, museums, libraries, all of that is part that we need to put some funding towards. And third, we need a national conversation about CCUS in a just transition. What is its role? What could its role be? So multiple levels of work there.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks so much to all of our panelists. Thank you, Dave, for presenting the results. And with that, we are going to take a 5-minute break and be back with a third panel. Thank you, everyone.
For our third and final panel, there have been some fantastic conversations so far, and we truly appreciate all of the interactive dialogue happening on the Q&A. It's been fantastic. So today's third and final panel will be exploring some of the opportunities and obstacles as California moves forward in the carbon capture and storage space. Just this week, the lab issued its most recent report on this, looking at the regulatory framework that dictates a lot of the activities around CCS. And we're happy to welcome Dr. George Caritas, who is the lead author of that report, with us today to moderate the final panel. George is the director of the lab's carbon management and partnerships area, and will also be speaking to some of the highlights in the research in that report, in addition to welcoming our other panelists. So thank you so much, George, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Sally. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today and for sticking with us. We have an illustrious third panel, which I will promptly introduce, and we're very happy to have you with us today. We have Rajinder Sahota from the California Air Resources Board. Rajinder is very much a CARB veteran. She's currently the chief of the Industrial Strategies Division. Matt Baker from the California Natural Resources Agency. He is the Deputy Secretary of Energy. And Matt has spent a good deal of time in the philanthropy world. He was a public utility commissioner in Colorado, and he has also done a stint in the NGO world. And last but not least, we have Sarah Zalta from the Stanford Center for Carbon Storage. Sarah is the executive director, and she has spent a long career at Chevron, holding various technical and executive positions. So we're very glad to have you with us. The theme of the panel today is opportunities and barriers. So having been through why we need CCS in California's climate portfolio, how it might be received, and what boundaries it needs to respect locally, we're now going to turn more to policy and to regulation. So without further ado, I will hand over to our panelists for their opening remarks. Rajinder, would you like to go first, please? Looks like you're muted, if I may interrupt you quickly.
Sorry about that. So good morning, and thank you for the invitation to be here, to both you and to Roger. And I've really enjoyed the discussion that's happened so far. So I work at the California Resources Board. We have had 50 years of experience regulating traditional air quality issues in the state, primarily mobile sources. When AB 32 was signed in 2006, our jurisdiction expanded to address greenhouse gases from all sources in the state. And as part of AB 32, what CARB is required to do is develop a scoping plan. And that scoping plan is updated every 5 years, and it tracks progress towards our targets, and it looks at how to lay the path for the next set of targets or goals that we have. So our last scoping plan in 2017 laid out a technically possible and a cost-effective path to achieving our 2030 target. This year, we kick off the process to develop our update for the 2022 scoping plan due next year. And it will look at the progress we made, any tweaks that we need to make sure we're on track to hit 2030, which is 40% below 1990 levels. And we will also have a forward-looking piece on how to chart a path to carbon neutrality. That's a long planning horizon, and that's why the legislation asks that we update this report every 5 years to check progress, make adjustments, and incorporate any new goals or legislation that have come into place or executive orders. The scoping plan will be developed over 2 years of workshops and modeling. We've already had many years of workshops on carbon neutrality, at least 2.5. But I think the thing that has come through in the workshops that we've had, the modeling that's been put out by third parties, academics, other think tanks, is that this decade, 2021 to 2030, is critical to hitting that carbon neutrality target in 2045. It's not like we can sit back and wait until 2030, 2035 to start thinking about what to get on the ground to make sure we hit that 2045 target. All of the modeling now shows that the deployment of clean technology, the deployment of clean fuels, and the development of the policies and regulations to get that out there is going to be this decade. And so this is very critical for all of the state agencies as we think about that scoping plan due next year. And it's very critical in the context of, you know, a new administration at the federal level also looking to take bold and significant action on climate. So the conversations in California matter, not just for us, but for helping to inform a national discussion. The science says that we cannot achieve global carbon neutrality without CCS. And I want to focus on that piece, that when we talk about avoiding the worst impacts of climate change, it really is the global emissions loading into the atmosphere, because these are global pollutants. But in California, we have a goal of hitting a carbon neutrality target for California by 2045, and that means pushing on all sectors to reduce emissions, and then maximizing all the potential sinks opportunities that we have out there. Our AB 32 targets for 2020 and 2030 have been based on reducing emissions in the fossil sectors. So this is manufacturing and energy. And natural working lands, carbon dioxide removal technologies like CCS and direct air capture, they've been sitting out there, but our push so far has been going after those emissions from the sources that are producing them for the fossil side. When we think about carbon neutrality in science, we have to recognize that it doesn't matter where those emissions come from, and that once in the atmosphere, they all contribute to global warming and global climate change. And so we are going to be shifting our perspective post 2030 to thinking about the fossil emissions and natural working lands emissions. And we know already that our natural working lands will be a source of emissions mid-century. So our goal is going to be to reduce the amount of emissions from the natural working lands as much as possible, but acknowledging that we will still have some residual amount out there. But not all natural working lands emissions are bad. Some of that is the natural carbon cycle, and we need to recognize that and try and account for that. So there's work underway at ARB to try and tease out what we think is a natural cycle for California's natural working lands. And then we think about other residual emissions in the system, and the system being all sources and sinks. We do have sectors that are going to be hard to decarbonize, but we need. We have cement out there that can't be electrified with the technology that we know today, and it needs high heat for its processes, and it has process emissions. We're going to need cement. We think about building housing and making sure there's enough homes for everyone in California and infrastructure. How the cement plants are going to matter unless we want to import all of that cement from somewhere else, which has another set of emissions associated with it. We will need low carbon transportation fuels, renewable biodiesel and ethanol. Those will have emissions, and those are going to be part of our sustainable future. So we need to think about how to handle any emissions coming off of those generation facilities. We know that we're going to have air conditioning and we're going to have refrigeration for decades and decades. And so there's HFCs that will be in the atmosphere, and we need to figure out how to get those emissions accounted for and out of the atmosphere. And then more recently, we had SB 100, which was the Zero Carbon Electricity Report. It's due to be put out by CARB, CEC, and CPUC in the next few weeks. And it looked at getting to zero carbon electricity by 2045. Well, for reliability at this time, we are seeing a role for natural gas and hydrogen with CCS so that we can have zero carbon electricity and then also have reliability in our grid, especially as we think about expanding electrification in other sectors like buildings and in transportation and in industry. So we're going to have emissions. That's really the thing. We are going to have emissions, and we need to figure out what to do with those emissions. And we need to figure out how to do it over the next 10 years and actually start putting down real action to deal with those residual emissions, or else we're not going to hit that carbon neutrality target in 2045. So recognizing the importance of CCS and direct air capture, in 2018, ARB adopted a methodology to implement and quantify CCS and direct air capture emissions. And that protocol is on our website. And it was developed through a robust public process, and it took about 2 to 3 years to develop. It currently is tied to our low carbon fuel standard program at ARB. And the current credit price at LCFS is about $203 or $4 per ton. That financial incentive for crediting CCS and direct air capture, coupled with the 45Q credit, make it economical to think about deployment today. There's no financial barrier when you think about the stacking of those two incentive programs today. And we need that near-term financial incentive to support the projects, because we talk about CCS, but we haven't had CCS or direct air capture in California, especially the engineering solutions. And if we don't start testing some of those, we may decide it may not work. We may need to do something else, or we may not have all of the emissions still accounted for once we get CCS and direct air capture deployed. And we can't wait until 2030, 2035 to figure out what the next step is or what plan B is. And so that timeliness, that sense of urgency for this decade still remains, and that economic incentive is in place. And there is interest right now to actually try and get these projects deployed in California. The other thing I'll mention is that, even with California doing the protocol for CCS, there has been deployment of CCS elsewhere. And I think that some of the other panels will speak to that. And so this is not a newer or emerging technology. It isn't a technology that is currently in place and in use elsewhere. What we need to do is try and test its viability for California. And with that, I'll end my intro comments. Thanks, George.
Thank you very much, Rajinder. Very informative introduction, and also a perfect segue to some of the audience questions that we have received. Matt, would you go next, please?
Sure, thanks, George. Thanks, Rajinder. I'm Matt Baker. I'm Deputy Secretary for Energy at the California Natural Resources Agency. The Natural Resources Agency is kind of an umbrella agency. It's best to kind of think of it as like the department, the equivalent of the Department of Interior, probably with a little bit of a Department of Energy thrown in. Some of our departments leads on this issue include the Department of Conservation, the California Energy Commission, but a number of other of our boards and commissions also engage in this, potentially could be engaged in this issue as well, including the State's Lands Commission and CAL FIRE, et cetera. As Rajinder pointed out, I think it's pretty clear that, we're going to need to address pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it and doing something with it, or storing it in some way, or using it in some way where it won't go back into the atmosphere. And the two areas that we're looking at, that we've looked at, are on the natural and engineered side, and that's I have to say that the natural side really is where the Natural Resources Agency is focusing and putting a lot of its energy, but we're also very interested in the engineered side as well. And then finally, I think the other area where we're looking at it and see it as a pathway to carbon removal is looking at carbon removal from the end of the pipe perspective. I'm working with Rajinder and a number of people in state government in looking at this issue. And I think the question that we're really trying to answer right now is, how do we determine what is appropriate for California? And then how do we develop a process for what is appropriate for California to help to actualize that vision? And I think of it in terms of three questions that we're trying to answer. First one is what is the need and where is the need? And this I'm just gonna, I think Rajinder really nailed that question. It's kind of those last increments in the power sector. We need to do something. It might be carbon capture. In industry, there's a lot that we just don't, where we don't have any solutions, as Rajinder has pointed out. The average person in the United States, on a per capita basis, we use 650 pounds of steel every year per person. We use about that much in cement, so that's every single year. So that's, like over a ton of emissions per person just in those two areas. In California, our cement production, we're the second largest cement producer in the country. We have some of the highest energy intensity in the world to produce a ton of cement. We produce about our carbon emissions from cement are about 60% greater than they are per ton in China, and also greater than they are in India. So there's a lot that we could be doing right now in industry. I also want to point out, so that's kind of the hard stuff in industry. The easy stuff in industry are places where we're actually just venting almost pure CO2 right into the air, whether it's production of ethanol or the production of hydrogen. These are kind of low-hanging fruits that we should capture those right away. And then finally, as Virginia pointed out, as we get closer to mid-century, carbon removal from the atmosphere becomes more and more and more important. And I think the synergy of all of these technologies together, including the natural lands, actually can work together to help us to address that problem. So that's the first question, what is the need? Second question that we need to ask are, and some of these came up in the previous panel as well, what are the benefits? What are the co-benefits in this? Where can we quantify criteria of pollution benefits, with these technologies? How can we value community engagement and community input, particularly in places in siting decisions and in, on either side of the pipe, so to speak? What are the opportunities for economic development? Are there economic development opportunities around taking biomass and turning it into hydrogen, like is described in the report? And where can those economic development opportunities be located? Particularly in the levee, in the Delta region, are there benefits that can be accrued in terms of addressing problems around subsidence and levees? Our agency is also very concerned about water, because the Department of Water Resources is housed there as well. Wildfires, another consideration. And finally, the economic transition. Are there ways that people who, through no fault of their own, their jobs are becoming more obsolete as a result of climate change? In many cases, these are good jobs with union wages. Is there a path for those folks to continue being productive in society? So that's the second set of questions. Can we accrue any benefits? And then the last thing that we're looking at is, what are the challenges in these projects? And I think George is going to talk more about this, and so is Sarah. But these are new technologies. They often expand. They often go across multiple jurisdictions. They're generally thought of as kind of a system versus a single site. The permitting these can be very, very difficult. And oftentimes they're also very, very costly. It's carbon capture and carbon removal is not something you would do if you could do anything else. And then the last thing I want to just say as a challenge, and something that we're very, very interested in, it ties into some of the co-benefits. How do these projects achieve a license to operate, or a social license to operate? And how can public support be built into any of these types of things? So with that, I'll kind of end my talk. I would just say, we're trying not to deal with either carbon removal or carbon capture, whatever your terminology really is, an abstraction. We're really trying to think about it as these are projects that are looking at solving a very specific problem. How important is that problem that they're trying to solve? What are the benefits that accrue in the value chain, of that project? What are the challenges? What are the implements or the impediments to those? How are people actually engaged in the decision-making process through all of the, through this whole procedure? And those are the kinds of things that at the state we're asking ourselves. And it's a conversation that we're, looking that the legislature needs to be involved, communities need to be involved, academics, groups like this really need to be engaged. And, it's a discussion we hope to have over the next year.
Great, many thanks, Matt. And Sarah, over to you.
Great, thank you. Well, as Kate Gordon mentioned in her introductory remarks, Stanford and the Energy Futures Initiative recently completed a study on the CCS potential in California, which summarizes the opportunities and the challenges for CCS in the state, and also proposes some novel solutions. California, as has been stated quite a few times this morning, has one of the largest geologic storage potentials in the United States. And we believe it has the capacity to store over 70 gigatons of CO2. And the bulk of this potential is located in the Central Valley. And we at Stanford came to this conclusion by looking at existing studies by the USGS, the Department of Energy, the CEC, and the Lawrence Livermore study, and others. And we high-graded previously identified opportunities. To high grade, we considered the LCFS and the EPA minimum siting criteria, and we added in some additional criteria around size. We only considered sites that could store a minimum of around 3 million tons of CO2. And we also added in additional criteria around injectivity. So from a reservoir engineering perspective, when you inject CO2, it requires a zone that has an adequate combination of reservoir thickness, porosity, permeability, and pore pressure conditions. So any data that suggested that a region had one or more of these parameters that might hinder the ability to inject large quantities of CO2 at sufficient rates was eliminated. We also assessed locations where we would not want to put CO2 underground. For example, in regions of high population density, near recently active faults, or in sensitive habitats. We also looked at capturable industrial and electricity sector emissions, and we identified 76 sources of capturable CO2 emissions. And these sources currently emit 60 million tons of CO2 per year. I should mention that capture costs range from a low of $20 a ton for ethanol, which is a fairly pure stream of CO2 and does not require separation, to $80 a ton and above on natural gas combined cycle power plants and some combined heat and power plants. However, even with these capture costs, there are 34 facilities that, if retrofit with CCS, could generate positive revenue with both the LCFS credits and the federal 45Q tax credits stacked on. These 34 facilities could abate over 20 million tons of CO2 per year. Some of the emission sources that I previously mentioned of the 76 are co-located directly above a potential storage resource, or they're within 10 miles of suitable CO2 storage location. And so they'd require relatively minimal infrastructure development. And as already has been mentioned, the primary objective of CCS is to reduce CO2 emissions and mitigate climate change. However, post-combustion capture can also result in the reduction of criteria air pollutant emissions from certain facilities. CCS activities also support employment for skill sets which may otherwise become obsolete in a clean energy transition, and provide a strong foundation for the emerging hydrogen economy and carbon dioxide removal jobs. CCS infrastructure can also enable the emergence of new industries such as hydrogen production, direct air capture, and bioenergy with CCS or BECCS. All of these technologies will rely on geologic storage of CO2. And I'd like to close by touching on the current pipeline of CCS projects. There are currently 21 CCS projects up and running globally. None of these are in California. We need upwards of 2,000 CCS projects by 2045 to meet the IPCC goals of limiting temperature rise to 2 degrees C. And according to the Global CCS Institute, another 60 CCS projects are under development. And I will note that some of these are in California. The project list grows by about 10% a year, but it really needs to grow by about 20%. We believe that California has a great opportunity to be a big part of this solution. Over to you, George.
Sarah, thank you. And thank you to all three of you. Just listening to you, it sounds like we have the proverbial climate challenge in our hands here in a nutshell. We have a very urgent need to deploy these technologies. We have an absolute mandate to be respectful to local needs and communities. We have a time crunch, and we also have some administrative challenges ahead of us, which were the impetus of a report that we just completed here at Livermore. So I'll touch on that briefly, and then we'll open up to questions and see how we can bring everything together. And of course, as Sarah mentioned, we also have a big opportunity in our hands. California has some of the best geology in the nation to do carbon storage. If you're a geologist, you really do appreciate California's and rocks and what they have to offer, but we will have to proceed in a certain way to make sure we capitalize on these opportunities. Okay, so let me share my screen here. Here we go. So this is the cover and the title of a report that we literally just issued. Here's the URL for it. If you don't want to copy the URL, just Google LLNL CCS permitting and it will come up. And the objective here is to figure out whether any of this is actually feasible in practice. So we've heard about the needs to deploy these technologies and to do it so in a certain way, but is it actually possible? Can you get the authorizations needed in order to get some of these projects up and running? So I'm going to give you a preview here of some of the conclusions and the findings of the report and urge you to take a look. So the first point that we soon arrived at is that this is a very complex undertaking for two reasons. One is that a CCS project in itself is a convoluted affair. You're piecing together three stages: the capture, which removes the CO2 from the source; the transportation, which could be barge, rail, truck, pipeline; and then finally the storage, which means that you need to have pore space rights, mineral rights shored up, and injection sites, a place to put an injection well, and some monitoring wells. So viewed as a matrix, you'll see all these subtasks that have to be accomplished in order to make a project possible. So you need to be compliant with local land use rules. You need to possibly site a CO2 pipeline. You need to get an air permit. Your CO2 pipeline needs to meet certain specs, safety specs. You need to get an injection well permit. You may be discharging certain things to water. There may be dredge or fill material involved. You need to be mindful of endangered species. Some actions may or may not trigger a stream, river, or lake alteration. You will need to undertake greenhouse gas reporting. And then last but not least, to make the project possible in the first place, you will be applying for some kind of CO2 credit. And the two chief venues for that right now, the California Air Resources Board's CCS protocol and the federal 45Q tax credit. So this is a pretty convoluted affair, and you'll see that there are many state agencies involved, many federal agencies. There will be local government involvement as well, and tribes and private parties may also feature into the authorization chain. This figure here tries to summarize the turnaround time, the technical complexity, and finally the political risk or exposure for some of these authorization tasks. And here you'll see a variety of gradings. For the most part, the needed authorizations will be of a low political exposure. It will be a technical affair. Some of these will be very technically involved. So getting a certification for injection well permit or for LCFS credits from CARB is no trivial affair. In fact, it's pretty lengthy, and for good reason. And then you'll see that some of these can be done relatively quickly. Some of them may take more than 18 months, or in some cases, several years. So what we're left with here is a picture that points to a very serious undertaking, both from the applicant's point of view, but also from the agencies that will be evaluating the permits and undertaking environmental review for these projects. So a snapshot here of our key findings. Good news first. This is not being done in a vacuum. I saw a question from Sarah in the Q&A box earlier about have we learned anything from the Southern California natural gas leak? I presume you mean Aliso Canyon. The answer is, fortunately, yes, absolutely. The reason these authorizations are convoluted is because people, regulators, have learned from some of these cases. And in fact, they have established very specific regulations for CCS project in the last several years. So the EPA regulations date to 2010, the CARB regulations date to 2018, and it's safe to say that they are the most comprehensive CCS regulations in any jurisdictions. A well like Aliso Canyons would never have even passed the LAF test under these. So we have concluded that California has a robust and extensive array of regulations that can safeguard public health, safety, and the environment from these projects. Now, is that enough? No, because we have also an overriding objective here to do something about climate change and to meet the state's goals. So under the status quo, we think that it's very unlikely that we can get a sufficient number of projects authorized in time to make a significant contribution to these goals. And there's also no guarantee that agency coordination, staffing, resourcing, funding will be in place to carry out the task. In addition to processing of actual permits, we have a very significant overlay of environmental review, primarily by CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, and also in some cases possibly by NEPA, the national equivalent. And these will be, in our view, the key determinant, these reviews, of a project authorizations timeline, which is likely to span several years. Now, what can we do about all this? Well, we actually don't believe that we need any major statutory or structural reforms. We think that most of these topics are readily addressable, the bulk of them in the short term, using some straightforward operational and organizational fixes and without major reforms. We also think that we're going to need a small number of regulatory and statutory fixes. These are mostly technical in nature and not overarching or extremely ambitious. And then finally, we need to underscore the need for project developers to take this very seriously. This is not a nuisance that has to be tackled on the side. This is a major undertaking, both in terms of dealing with agencies and private parties, but also in conducting oneself as a developer responsibly and while respecting local communities and local needs. So I think we're going to see there is a need for an increased level of resource allocation and also sophistication from project proponents themselves to make sure that they do this properly. So this is a snapshot. I do urge you to take a look at the report itself, and happy to answer any questions. So with a few minutes remaining, let's try and field some of the audience questions quickly here. So there's a question, I believe for you, Rajinder, from Theo Pajos, who says, we are hearing that the scoping plan is not going to address CCS until the state transitions away from natural gas generation and in-state refining. Is that true?
So the next scoping plan will talk about the role of CCS, direct air capture, and natural working lands as carbon dioxide removal potential sinks for the system. Because when we look out to 2045, and as I mentioned in my opening comments, we will have residual emissions. We have to take care of those. And if we're going to say we have a plan to hit a carbon neutrality, that means carbon dioxide removal.
Great. Thanks, Rajinder. I'll try and combine now two questions, one from Lorelei Oviatt in Kern County and one from Roger Bales at UC Merced. Lorelei says, this is an important conversation, but the property tax revenue piece that provides critical services to communities seems to be missing. I'm not aware that there would be any such revenues. And Roger also says, what financing mechanisms should the state consider for the programs discussed here? Some of the measures are multi-benefit, not just carbon storage, with associated benefits, for some being brought to the state and some being more specific to some specific sectors. So I think these are questions about how would the local communities benefit from an undertaking like this, and what does the state need to do in addition to what it's done already in order to make this a reality.
You want me to take that?
Yeah, Matt, if you want to start, and I can add in if there's anything else left.
Yeah, I'll start with the property tax issue. I think that's an extraordinarily important issue, particularly as you know, as there will be decline in you know, in the production of fossil fuels, that it becomes you know, a very important issue, especially for places like Kern County, and it's one that we're actively looking at. You know, one of the things that we've been looking at is just how are other forms of underground storage treated. I should say that, but I should also point out that in many cases, you know, the carbon removal and the carbon storage is just kind of the tail end of the of the jobs creator or the property tax generator, you know, whether it's an ethanol plant or whether it's something that's creating hydrogen, you know, for a new economy, you know, or producing electricity. I think those will continue to be the generators for local property taxes.
And the way that I think about it is that we have a need for low carbon fuels. We're going to have a need for things like cement and glass and steel. We're going to have a need for refrigeration systems, which means the things that we know are going to be part of our future, we need to figure out how to keep the jobs associated with that, the economics associated with that, and the benefits of that local tax base in state. And CCS is a way to make those industries or those sources get to zero for the accounting purposes for meeting CN and making sure that we keep those benefits in state.
And just a little bit more on the local benefits. There's some local air quality improvements. Many industrial facilities that have high CO2 emissions also emit high levels of criteria air pollutants such as sulfur dioxide, nitrous dioxide, and particulates. And this is particularly true near our refineries, less so near our power plants in California. And with carbon capture retrofits, we can get some local air quality improvements. And there are two ways this can happen. One way is that engineering specifications for a CCS retrofit system require the stack gases to be relatively free of SO2 and particulate matter. So the bottom line is you need to scrub the gases a bit before you can capture the CO2. And secondly, when you install a carbon capture system, it's often treated as a significant modification of the emitter's equipment. This is from a permitting point of view. And therefore the emitter may become subject to what would be current or usually tighter emissions standards. So these are just some of the local air quality improvements. Also mention just local economic activity. In our study, we used the Cal EnviroScreen tool, and that was shown earlier. And we used it to get an insight where CCS development might occur in relationship to socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. Historically, these communities have had to bear the brunt of industrial and power development with limited community benefit. We found a large portion of the emission sources in the potential CO2 storage sites fall in these high unemployment areas. And CCS projects on both the capture and the storage side can definitely stimulate local economic activity, including new construction, operations, and maintenance kinds of jobs. And then, of course, we would expect to see multiplier effects across the supply chain to drive additional benefits. Finally, on job creation, the CCS activities can support employment for skill sets that may otherwise become obsolete in the clean energy transition, and as we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And this includes jobs around process engineering, and of course, jobs that are subsurface related, geologists, drillers, engineers on the storage side.
Great. And with that, I hate to announce that we're almost at time, so we will have to wrap up. But we're very grateful for your being here today and for your contributions, and we'll turn it back to Sally.
Thank you so much, George, and thanks to everybody for your participation in today's event. We had a feeling there was going to be a pretty robust discussion, and we really appreciate people's contributions via the Q&A. As was mentioned in the chat, if we didn't get to your question, we will be sure to follow up with those directly whose questions did not get answered. Both of the reports that were referenced today, both Getting to Neutral and the permitting study, are available obviously at the lab site as well as at the Livermore Lab Foundation's website, which is just livermorelabfoundation.org. There are many of these conversations continuing around the state, and I wanted to make sure I highlighted just one of them is happening next week, next Friday, March 12th with CCST. And it's also featuring Holly Buck, who was one of our earlier speakers today. So be sure to visit their website and register for that event next Friday. Today's webinar was recorded, and we will make sure to have slides and recordings available again, most likely via our website as soon as we can get it up there. And we will also be sending out a post-event survey. As we have said earlier, this was just the beginning of a conversation with many of you, and we truly appreciate the questions and comments that were shared, and we hope to continue that conversation. So please feel free to respond to that survey when it lands in your inbox. And we look forward to hopefully engaging with this community many more times going forward. So on behalf of Lawrence Livermore National Lab, the California Council on Science and Technology, and the Livermore Lab Foundation, thank you so much for being here today, and we wish you well.